As I said, Darwin in The Origin of Species explained how all life forms on the planet are related via common descent, how they all have derived from one original species that lived several billion years ago. However, the reason that On the Origin of Species was such an important book was that not only did Darwin successfully argue for this relatedness of all life forms, he also came up with an explanation for why it is that population of animals change over time, how it is that populations of animals adapt to their environment. That explanation was what he called natural selection. Now, one way in which we can present Darwin's thoughts on natural selection is to come up with 4 postulates that Darwin himself made about populations. And as it turns out, if these 4 postulates are true, then it follows self-evidently that natural selection must occur, that populations of animals will adapt over time to their environment. So let's have a look at the 4 postulates and examine each of them in turn. So postulate number 1. Individuals within a species vary in their characteristics. This seems perhaps self-evidently to be true. If you have a population of birds or of cats or of horses or whatever, then they won't be exactly alike. There will be differences in coloration and in size and in muscular strength and in beak size if you're looking at birds maybe, etc., etc. So postulate number 1 seems to be self-evidently true. However, it should be mentioned that at Darwin's time, thinking in terms of distributions of traits or characteristics was not as natural, perhaps, as it is today. There, the focus was more on the essence of a species. You would think not of a diversity of different traits, but instead of the typical representative from any given species. Nevertheless, postulate number 1 seems to be true. Individuals do vary in their characteristics. Postulate number 2, some of those variations are heritable. That means that the offspring will inherit them and that trait will be carried by later generations. Again, this obviously seems to be true. You resemble your parents. The offspring of an animal in some population will have some of the traits of its parent. Obviously, some variation is not heritable. For instance, if a cat eats the wing of a bird, then that's not something that the offspring will inherit, if that bird ever gets offspring, that is. Nevertheless, postulate number 2, some of the variation is genetic in nature. It's inherited by the offspring. That's also true. Postulate number 3, in every generation, more young are produced than will themselves survive to reproduce. Again, that's obviously true for some species, like, for instance, fish, which may lay millions of eggs, but where only a handful, maybe 1 or 2 fish themselves will grow old enough to lay eggs of their own that will then hatch, etc. For other species, it's perhaps not quite as self-evident, but nevertheless, it turns out to be true for those also. For instance, Darwin actually at some point has a discussion about elephants, which he took to be one of the slowest breeding animals he could think of. They are pregnant for a quite long time and they don't get that much offspring. Nevertheless, Darwin calculated that if African elephants, for instance, if all the offspring of African elephants survived and themselves had offspring, all of which survived, etc., etc., then in a matter of a few hundred years, less than 1,000 years, Africa would essentially be filled coast to coast with elephants. And that's obviously not happening. So again, this means even for slow breeding animals like elephants, some offspring will not survive long enough to get offspring of its own. So postulate number 3, also true. Finally, postulate number 4, and this is the essence of natural selection, you would say. The survival and reproduction of the individuals that we just discussed is not random. Instead, those individuals that do survive and go on to reproduce are those that somehow have the most favorable traits, the most favorable variant in this diverse population that we discussed in postulate number 1. And they are the ones that are naturally selected. This means that because we have so much variation up here, some of that variation can be inherited and not all individuals survive. And because only the most favorable individuals go on to survive and reproduce, that over time populations will adapt to their environments. They will change over time and become more and more fit. They will fit their environment better and better. I'm going to walk you through this on the next few slides. So a good way to think of evolution is to think of it, I would suggest, as a two-step process. First, you have a random step. You have DNA mutations, we now know, is what generates diversity, which forms all of these different characteristics within any given population of animals. Then you have step number 2, which is not random, and that is what we call natural selection. Among all of these diverse animals in the population, we now have non-random differential survival and reproduction of the variants, where the most fit variants are the ones that survive, they're the ones that lead to offspring, and therefore the genes that will propagate in a population of animals. So let's just take an example to maybe make that idea completely clear. So imagine, for instance, that you have a population of butterflies living on the bark of some tree that I've indicated in this cartoon. Let's say that the butterflies have white wings, like the one I've shown up here. These butterflies are food items for birds. Birds will fly down, spot one of these white butterflies on the tree and eat them. So imagine that at some point in time there's a point mutation in the DNA, a single nucleotide is changed perhaps, and that single change causes the wing color of the butterfly to now be much darker, like the second butterfly I've indicated at the lower right here. This, it is hopefully clear, is much harder to spot on the bark than the white-winged butterfly. So this means that when a bird flies down, there's a much smaller probability, a much smaller risk that this butterfly will be eaten than that the white-winged butterfly will be eaten. That means that most of the time when a bird flies down, it will eat a white-winged butterfly, not the dark-winged mutant variant that just arose. So let's assume, for instance, that this butterfly survives long enough to have offspring of its own. And let's say it maybe has 10 offspring. This means that in the next generation, we now have 10 dark-winged butterflies, assuming they all inherited this mutation. Again, birds will fly down. It will be easier to spot the white-winged versions than the dark-winged versions. So most of the dark-winged butterflies will probably survive. Let's say 9 of the 10, for instance, survive one extra generation to have offspring of their own. Each of these, again, get 10 offspring, and we now have 90 dark-winged butterflies. You can see that if this continues, and in each generation, birds will more probably they will more easily spot the white-winged version, meaning that the dark-winged version has a higher probability of surviving. If this goes on for sufficiently long, then after a number of generations, the frequency of the dark-winged mutation in the population will increase until the point where maybe the entire population has the dark-winged version, the dark-winged allele of this gene. And we say at this point that the mutation has become fixed in the population. This is the very simple but very powerful idea behind natural selection. You have random generation of diversity, DNA mutates, forming a diversity of different traits in a population. This is followed by non-random differential survival and reproduction. The random mutations that for entirely random reasons fit well in their environment are the ones that survive. Those that do not fit, they don't get offspring or they don't survive for long enough to leave offspring. So over time, only the best fitting genes, the best fitting variants are the ones that survive, meaning that over time a population will adapt to its environment. It's an extremely simple idea, but nevertheless it's a very powerful explanation for many natural phenomena. There were, of course, many things that Darwin did not know at the time he wrote On the Origin of Species. One of them, importantly, was the molecular basis for heredity. In fact, some of the ideas presented about heredity in his book were entirely erroneous and were based on an idea called blending inheritance, which, as it turns out, would not work well for natural selection. However, as we now know, the molecular basis for heredity is the DNA molecule, this double-stranded molecule which is held together by base pairs between complementary nucleotides. This structure, where G always base pairs with C and A always base pairs with T, is the reason that we can make perfect copies of cells. The double-stranded DNA molecule, as you presumably know, is split apart, and each of the single-stranded halves of the original molecule can then form the template for the synthesis of the complementary strand, G base pairing with C, A and T base pairing, thus forming two perfect copies of the original DNA molecule. This is the reason that a cell, as I said, can make a copy of itself, and this is why you look like your parents. This is why traits are inherited by offspring. Another thing that was not known at the time of Darwin was the origin or the molecular basis for variation. Why do animals in a population look different? Again, this has to do with DNA. Sometimes the copying process I just mentioned is not perfect. Sometimes when you take the two strands, separate them, and then construct the second strand on the first strand template, sometimes a wrong nucleotide is inserted, like I've indicated on this slide, for instance. When that happens, if there's a second round of replication and this error is not caught by the machinery for error detection that is present in most cells, if that occurs, then at this point we will have an entirely new base pair, AT, instead of the original GC, for instance. And we will then have a mutated DNA molecule. Replication errors like this, it turns out, is one of the major sources of novelty, one of the major sources of DNA mutation that forms the raw material for evolution. It's of course also possible to get mutations from things such as radiation or from chemicals, but the major source, it appears, of DNA mutation in evolution is in fact replication errors. It should be mentioned maybe at the end here that in addition to natural selection, which was the mechanism that Darwin suggested for why evolution occurs, for why populations change over time, in addition to natural selection, there are, we now know, other reasons why populations can evolve. These include, perhaps on one side, one might mention sexual selection as one of these mechanisms. Sexual selection is actually a form of natural selection. It's just a form of natural selection where the selection is done based on mate choice. It's a bit unclear whether sexual selection is in fact a sort of feedback phenomenon. If, for instance, a female randomly evolves a preference for some male trait, then there will be very strong selection for the males to evolve that trait, and that could be entirely random and even meaningless traits that were selected for. For instance, one might argue that the peacock's tail here is a disadvantage if you're trying to escape a predator, and that sexual selection has gone off on a tangent here. Alternatively, it might be that sexual selection is actually, to some degree, based on the phenomenon where you are actually showing off the quality of your genes. If you can get away with having a big tail and still escape predators, then you're probably strong and healthful, and this might make sense in that case to mate with you. But probably it's a mix of these phenomena that's going on. So sexual selection, one way in which evolution can also occur. Another major way that Darwin did not discuss or think of is that of random evolution, or what we might term genetic drift under one heading. Genetic drift are all the phenomena where we get a random sample of alleles from some population, and there are many different ways in which that can happen. For instance, population bottlenecks is one such phenomenon. We'll return to that, where only a few members of a population survive. Then the few surviving members might have a very different set of alleles than were present in the original population. Founder effects, quite similar. One animal or a few animals make it to a deserted island, for instance, and found a new population. That's entirely similar. And finally, neutral evolution, where you have different genotypes that in fact have the same fitness, but where one of them, for entirely random reasons, is the one that survived. This means that different populations will drift off in different directions without actually being selected for it. We now know that all of these, in fact, also play a large and important role in the evolution of populations.